Welcome to our Presidential Powers Project presentation, where we will evaluate the executive actions of one U.S. President. My name is Nedah Ahmad,
I'm Julian Gavino.
And I'm Dan Healey.
and we will be evaluating the 43rd President of the United States, George W. Bush. Born July 6th of 1946 in New Haven, Connecticut, George W. Bush had an eventful life before becoming president. Shortly after graduating from Harvard Business School, Bush joined the Texas Air National Guard as a pilot. After being honorably discharged, Bush invested in several business ventures, including a small oil exploration company and as the co-owner of the Texas Rangers baseball club. Bush's political career began in 1978 with an unsuccessful run for the House of Representatives, after which Bush began working on his father's presidential campaign. Using the exposure brought about by his father's presidency, Bush successfully ran for governor of Texas in 1993 and 1998, and later as the president in 2000.
While Bush attempted to largely limit his use of presidential power, his largest use of executive action was during the two largest crises during his presidency, 9/11 and the Great Recession. While the single largest use of Bush's presidential power by far was in response to 9/11. As the single deadliest attack on the nation since Pearl Harbor, the years after 9/11 were filled with uncertainty and chaos. Using the bully pulpit, Bush promised retaliation for the attacks in his bullhorn speech to workers at Ground Zero. Acting as commander-in-chief, Bush, with the blessing of Congress, took military action to ensure order and protect the nation. He was given authorization to use military force by Congress against any entities responsible for or that aided in 9/11, and later authorization to use military force in Iraq. However, not all of his decisions were supported by Congress. One of his most controversial actions, Executive Order 13228, gave the NSA the ability to wiretap suspected terrorists through the terrorist surveillance program. To many Americans, this executive order, as well as his administration's treatment of terrorist detainees, appeared unnecessary and infringed on the rights of citizens.
Throughout the course of his presidency, Bush issued a total of 12 presidential vetoes, none of which were pocket vetoes. Some notable laws that were passed during his presidency were the USA Patriot and USA Freedom Acts, which were passed in response to the events that occurred on 9/11. The USA Patriot gave the federal government extensive ability to spy on potential suspects of terrorism, which, as was touched on in the previous slide, was congressionally acceptable but received significant public backlash. So it was amended by the USA Freedom to give both US citizens and foreigners more privacy. Similarly, the No Child Left Behind Act, or NCLB for short, was an educational reform endorsed by Bush and passed by Congress, but it received widespread criticism because of its unrealistic economic standards for education that states were expected to meet. It was also seen as a way for the federal government to increase their level of oversight in this otherwise state-mediated area of legislation. So Bush had relatively good relations with Congress in terms of their interests and the speed that legislation moved through the lawmaking process, especially as a Republican president with a majority Republican House of Representatives and a fluctuating Senate that became majority Republican towards the end of the 107th Congress and through the 109th Congress. Most of the criticism he received was from U.S. citizens themselves because of the infringements on their rights, such as privacy or states' rights.
As chief of party, President Bush influenced the majority Republican Congress to pass the Economic Growth and Tax Relief Reconciliation Act, which lowered individual tax rates. This meant that the individual could spend more money and stimulate the economy. The Jobs and Growth Tax Relief Reconciliation Act of 2003 was passed and meant to provide more jobs by reducing business expenses from taxes. Bush allowed for citizens to save a lot of money through tax cuts, and in total provided $1.7 trillion in relief. So in 2007, the average family of four earning $40,000 a year was saving around $2,000 from tax relief. However, this was money the government was not receiving. And additionally, the Iraq War racked up a huge debt from for the U.S. totaling up to nearly $2 trillion. This was an indirect. These two cases were an indirect cause of the Great Recession. The Great Recession lost citizens many jobs that were built up during the stimulated time period of Bush's tax cuts. As chief legislator, Bush pressured Congress to pass the Economic Stimulus Act of 2008, through which the government spent up to $152 million in providing financial relief to lower and middle income families. Now that we have analyzed President Bush's actions, we can make a final assessment as to how he wielded his presidential powers during his presidency. Some of Bush's actions could have been considered imperialistic. He overused many of his executive privileges during the war on terrorism with justifiable reasons at the time. Bush was very effective during the time of his presidency. He was able to strengthen the nation after 9/11 through his agenda. His overall grade is a B.